Ladies and gentlemen, get the book Dr. Joshua Bowen wrote, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It is extremely full of knowledge and information for anyone, as well as join the Patreon. There's hundreds of videos that have not released to the internet. So you can ask questions and I will record them with these scholars in high definition. I do that all the time. You can also personal message me and you help the community grow. Thanks a lot. Dr. Joshua Bowen, we've got a question from WM Law on my Patreon. Derek, I'm only on page 124 of his book. Being ex-Mormon, ex-Reformed Christian who's read the entire Old Testament, chapter 1 was a recap of the biblical story that I'm familiar with. My question relates to the Assyrian kingdom. As a Christian, we would be told that the Assyrian kingdom was a brutal kingdom that terrorized its neighbors and gave no quarter. But that there was a period of time when it waned. The Christians would say that is evidence of Jonah having preached to the Ninevites and them repenting. Is there any evidence of such a period in the archaeological record?
A period of them repenting?
Well,
the Ninevites?
It seems like they waned from being such cruel overlords, if that makes sense. And so Christians will say, see, Jonah did preach repentance from their wicked cruelty. You see?
So let me, no. So, taking the book of Jonah like that, trying to look for historical, seeing this as some sort of a historically reliable account of Jonah's life is probably not a good way to go about engaging with the text. One of the things that's clear about ancient Near Eastern history, and you can see it with the Assyrians quite clearly, is there is this pattern of expansion when a nation is strong and contraction when a nation is weak. And normally it hinges upon the ruler himself. So if you have a strong, sort of aggressive, clever ruler, you'll see expansion, you'll see annual campaigning, particularly out to the west from Assyria, and this growth of Assyria proper, and taking over, creating vassals and getting tribute and those sorts of things. So one of the kings that sort of epitomizes this big expansion after a period of contraction is Tiglath-Pileser III. And he comes to the throne in 745. So, 8th century, this is something that would be important to the history of the nation of Israel. And we see this reflected in the biblical text. So the Neo-Assyrian Empire has its periods of real strength. I talk about in the book how toward the end the Neo-Assyrian Empire starts to wane. And there are probably a lot of different reasons why it happened. Not because Jonah went and preached to them and they decided to give up their, militaristic ways. First of all, the picture that's, painted of the Assyrians or the Canaanites or the Amalekites or any of these people, of course, is that they're grossly immoral and wicked. They do everything horribly and they're just terrible. And of course, hopefully we all recognize this bit of propaganda going on here. And of course, the Neo-Assyrian Empire did this as well, right? So if you read through Mario Liverani's book, for example, on Assyria, which is actually right here, you'll see him talking about how the Assyrians portrayed themselves and justified their holy war, right? And when they did that, what they did is, much as the Israelites did, and much as every ancient people would have done in this position, you create an other, right? That you have to bring into subjection, bring into control. And the way that you justify doing that is you don't say, I just want to go conquer those people, right? Because, sorry, that's my 3-year-old up there. Because that doesn't look good, right? It doesn't reflect well, because there's still this idea that you have to have justification for doing what it is that you're doing. And the gods don't look kindly in the ancient Near East upon people doing oppressive things, much to everyone's surprise. Maybe that's in fundamentalist evangelical circles. The idea that the ancient Mesopotamian gods would have been against oppression, right? They were, right? You don't oppress the poor, you don't oppress the weak. So the kings still needed justification for doing these types of campaigns. And so one of the ways that they do it is the same way that you see in the Hebrew Bible. And that is they vilify the other side. Go figure, right? It's how we all do this. You think about the way that the Germans are portrayed when you watch, like Captain America or something. The Germans are always the super bad, right? And that's not to say that the Nazis weren't bad. Of course they were bad, right? But it can spread to all Germans, for example. Anyway, the point is that that might not have been a good example. I want to be clear that the Nazis were horrible, right? Just be clear.
Right.
But that vilification, that type of vilification, is something that you see in the ancient world all the time. And so because of that, the Assyrians would say, those people out to the west, the god Asher, our god Asher, extended his benevolent arm to them to bring them in and to care for them, and blah, 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 right? And of course,
right.
They rebelled. They rebelled against his arm, and so I have to go out and conquer them.
Same thing seems to take place kind of in the Canaan, or even another example biblically would be when the vilification of all the kings of the north come from the southern writers. I mean, are they really that bad and that horrible of a king in the north? Or is this a anachronistic explanation saying, well, the reason why this happened, all these bad kings happen to be there? Or why, and this, I'm leading into the Assyrian thing, is why did they stop being so, well, maybe they lost power. Like when Egypt, the reason why the Exodus, if we have this story as Ronald Hendel saw, well, what happened was they kind of went bankrupt and they collapsed, and now, boom. Yeah,
I mean, this is what happened right around 1200, right? So if people are interested in that sort of thing, Eric Klein has a phenomenal book. It's right there, called 1177, and we'll have him on the show here, I think, pretty soon. But it talks about this, regional collapse, international collapse. But a good example, maybe the German one wasn't all that good. It was, but you see this in the vilification of people from Arabic countries after 9/11.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody from the Middle East was then vilified, right? And you saw it horribly here in the United States, right? Now, certainly these terrorists were terrible, terrible people. They did terrible, terrible things. And I was on active duty when that happened in the Air Force. But that doesn't mean that all Arabic people are bad, right? And so they get vilified, they become the other. And that justifies, the sort of...
well, we get the same thing with racial tensions, too.
Yes.
Blacks are all bad in some people's eyes, or you look at these these cross-burning Ku Klux Klan members, and now all whites are the same way. You can get the same thing happen in almost any situation.
And so then if you're, but I think for me the material point is if you're trying to justify, just like somebody in the Ku Klux Klan wants to justify their hatred. Just like people that were incredibly anti-Semitic against the Jews during World War II. Anybody that wants to look at all Arabs and justify that bigotry as being justified, as okay to do. They're going to construct this narrative of the other, and they're going to say that the other side is doing things oftentimes that they would never do, right? What do they call that? Virtue signaling, I think is what they call that. But so what we see then in the biblical text is this sort of othering, and we see it with the New Assyrians as well. A really good example of this, and I feel like I want to clarify this because this came up recently in my book on the chapter on archaeology, talking about the Canaanites. There is this sort of vilification that you see of the Canaanites when it comes to child sacrifice. You see it all over the place in the Hebrew Bible. Oh, they're sacrificing their children to Molech, right? They're doing all these horrible, horrible things. And so I asked the question that Heath Durrell asked, and that is like, let's get to the bottom of what evidence do we have for child sacrifice among the Canaanites. And as it turns out, there isn't much, right? So then the question that we have to ask is, all right, sure, do we expect to have a lot of evidence for child sacrifice, like physical evidence in the archaeological record? Probably not. But what evidence do we have that people are using to justify their position, to justify the position that the biblical text is historically reliable? And the evidence that they're using is late evidence. It's from Carthage. It's not from Canaan. And so what evidence do we actually have from, Canaan proper? Nothing really solid, right? And so then if that's one data point that's, all right, we don't have this positive evidence, so then what other evidence do we have? Well, we seem to have evidence in the narrative of the Hebrew Bible that the Israelites were also practicing child sacrifice. So with those two things combined, we don't have any positive evidence from the period to say that, yes, in the second millennium, you've got child sacrifice. And that's why the Israelites had to come in and do this conquest. And we have seemingly positive evidence that the Israelites are doing this in the first millennium, which is the time that we probably think this Exodus story came to its form. Those two things combined, what's more reasonable to conclude? It's this othering. It's this othering that we see. And so again, the Neo-Assyrian Empire is othering and doing these campaigns. But when they don't have the strength to do it anymore, sort of bringing this back, when they don't have the strength to do it anymore, they're having to deal with problems, financial problems, they're having to deal with rebellions, they're having to deal with local issues, and all of those things make an administration, a kingdom focus in on itself in the same way that if you're having problems at home, it's difficult to go be successful doing something outside of the house because you have to deal with your own problems internally. And when you have internal problems, the empire tends to shrink back in on itself. And so it's a really convenient thing to say, in 586, not in 586, sorry, in 7, I was thinking of the fall of Jerusalem, but in 712, 710, when the Neo-Assyrian Empire falls to the Neo-Babylonian Empire, this is sort of the culmination of all these things contracting the Neo-Assyrian Empire in. And I think it would be foolish to say, well, it's, leading up to that, the contraction that we see, that must be because, we see repentance from Nineveh solely because we have that in the biblical text. I don't think that's good historiography.
Thank you.